I too want to take the opportunity to express our sympathies to all those who have died during this pandemic, and indeed to their families, some of whom couldn't be with their loved one at this very critical and very sad time, and that it makes it so much more difficult. The number of deaths in recent days is a stark reminder that this virus is still in a very active phase, and we're being told that that can be accounted for, the numbers, by delayed notification of deaths. But I think there are reasons to doubt that that is the only reason. And while there are positive signs in relation to the occupancy of ICUs and the number of people who have been hospitalised in comparison to what it might have been, what is of particular source of concern is the nursing home sector. Many of those who have died in nursing homes, where there continues to be a critical issue, both in terms of prevalence of cases and the ability to manage that in terms of availability of nurses and carers. Many nursing homes have staff who are ill, some have staff who are in hospital, and they're doing their absolute best to provide care, often to people who they have been looking after for years and who they care deeply about. But they need additional staff. The testing regime has been particularly problematic. In the absence of comprehensive testing, it was impossible to know who needed to be isolated. And we've been told in recent days that the illness presents differently in older people. So there were people who were not obvious cases that weren't picked up. And having talked to some staff and owners of nursing homes, they're shocked at how fast the residents are succumbing to the virus. And there's been an escalation in deaths. You only have to look at the death notices. I don't do this routinely, but I'm looking at it at the moment, and it's quite shocking. And it does make me question what we're being told in relation to these being deaths that happened several weeks ago. The big ask is for staff for the floor, nurses and carers. And what they've been promised, they have been promised, and there's funding there, but I'm told that at the coalface it's not happening. I'm talking to the owners of nursing homes who are telling me they're spending hours and hours and hours on the phone trying to get staff. If they were being provided with staff, or if there was something happening, that there was some level of coordination to deal with this, they would not be doing that. Will you address this issue specifically, Taoiseach, in your response? Because the staff can only work 16-hour days for so long, and that's what's happening at the moment. A second issue that we expected to see progress on is the childcare arrangements for frontline healthcare workers. And while this has to occur in a safe manner, and I completely accept that, there may well be several solutions. We need you to give us some sort of an indication of what the thinking is and what options might be available. And is there parallel planning occurring in terms of working with the childcare sector and also matching childcare workers with healthcare staff? And Taoiseach, direct provision is an area that I've got to say I've got deep concerns about. We've seen at least one confirmed outbreak following the distribution of a group of asylum seekers from a centre in Dublin to another centre in Kerry, despite having been exposed to a confirmed case. Surely herding groups of people who really have no choice in the matter around like this is against public health advice. It's difficult to see how that movement can be described in any different way to people going from one part of the country to the other. For example, over the Easter weekend, the concern that people were going on holidays. That needs to be dealt with, and we need to have an explanation as to why that's happening. There are other concerns about direct provision, about people sharing rooms and so on and so forth, and having to buy materials, sanitary materials. So there's a whole lot of issues in this area. if we were to get to grips with this virus and plan a transition out of the lockdown, it can't be done unless we set some tests against which we plan that exit. We have those tests been set. A robust and comprehensive testing and tracing regime is essential, and again, we need to see the capacity. And is the modelling also being done with respect to widening the definitions and how that might impact on that capacity? Given the speed at which this virus infects, the COVID app that's been developed might be very significant in terms of contact tracing, but it comes with a cost in terms of privacy and ultimately uptake. Because if there's a doubt about its use and if there's a lack of transparency, the uptake will not be there. It requires a critical mass, and it won't happen unless there's public trust. This is a measure you wouldn't see except in the most extreme situations which we now find ourselves in. The public have to buy in to what it is, how's it working, why it's being used, and how it will be decommissioned. That is really important, but this could be a very useful tool if that public trust can be gained. But that very much depends on how it is handled. Another critical area that we'll have to consider is availability, obviously, of hospital capacity, staffing, PPE, and we're hearing concerns yet again today about the unusability of some PPE that's been provided. We'll also have to see in that modelling a reducing level of infection. We need to hear about what kind of planning is underway, and the public need to hear this. Who's involved in the process? Who is being consulted? What is the likely sequencing? And while also acknowledging that health is the ultimate reference point for this, is it part of the reason why some of us have seen the public debate on transition plans and indeed a more meaningful role in assisting that. It's part of the reason why some of us have been seeking more involvement in transition plans and a different involvement for the Dáil. Like, for example, the 8th Amendment Committee is a very good example where a cross-party group could get to grips with a complex issue and be helpful. I think we've got to do things differently. We have a huge economic crisis because of the virus that can't be fully evaluated in the absence of knowing how this virus will act and how it ultimately will be tamed. But there's a third component, and that is one of social cohesion. And while the public have been magnificent in the part they have played, that can't be taken for granted. The public are central players. They've been passive because that has been what they have been asked to do. But their involvement in unravelling this in an organised and safe way requires their consent and requires public discussion and debate. It involves this Parliament not reverting to a traditional adversarial style of politics. A totally new approach is required, at least in the short term. With respect to the economy, any transition arrangements will need to bring on board and engage employer groups, trade unions, but there's also a whole cohort of people in the gig economy, workers that are not organised, that need to be involved. In many ways, the public have been way ahead on this issue and what needs to be done. They were calling for school closures before the school closures happened. They were calling for the cancellation of events like the Patrick's Day events before they happened. They were largely appalled at Cheltenham that it went ahead. And they're asking questions now about ports and airports and how they're managed. And there's a complete understanding that goods have to come in and out and there has to be some movement. But how are they being managed is something that has to be got to grips with. None of us would have envisaged the voluntary lockdown, which was responded to extremely well. And we had hoped the powers that we passed here in this House would not have had to be used, but understanding what happened around Easter, obviously they had to be used. And I think the Gardaí have done what they've done in the full knowledge that policing is done by consent, and that is largely how we have seen that happen. A couple of things have happened that would be of concern. One has been referred to by Deputy Martin in relation to the Debenhams employees, but the other about the contrast with the courts is a serious source of concern, and that's the kind of thing that there is public discontent about, or will be. We know there's a Cabinet subcommittee, and others have referred to that. We need to know way more in terms of, and we need to be much heavier. There needs to be much heavier involvement, drawing in expertise, but involving the public in that debate. Otherwise, what we will see is a breakdown of the consent that is there, and that is so necessary in dealing with this pandemic.
Feed